If you say that and listen to yourself, you should like go to a monastery for like 3 years and never say a word and have a shower every 10 minutes until you've learned your lesson properly. You know, you can't utter a more genocidal phrase than that, you know. And of course, you always do it in a display of your care for the world. It's like, well, if we just didn't have any people, it's like, well, we'll just line them all up and shoot them with machine guns. No, it's really sickening. It's appalling. And there's a hatred for humanity that's at the bottom of it. And I mean, you can kind of understand why, because we're messy and, you know, we don't clean up after ourselves and, you know, we're like raping the rainforests and that sort of thing. But I do have some sympathy for people because, you know, we're hell on Mother Nature, but she certainly returns the favor. So, and that's a good thing to remember. You know, a lot of what we're doing is just bloody well trying to exist with a relative minimum of pain. And we're doing our best to get, you know, to get as good at doing that as fast as we can. And that's not an easy thing. There are lots of us, and like life is bloody complicated. And the other thing that happens too is, again, if you scratch just beneath the surface of people, and this is something that's always, you know, to me has been a kind of miracle, is if you talk to someone, they're out doing their job, and maybe they're doing a good job at it, like some emergency room nurse, you know, it's, God, there's a job for you. Or maybe they work in palliative care. You know, and you talk to them and you find out they've got like 4, as I said before, serious problems in their family, and maybe they're diabetic to boot, and yet they haul themselves out of bed in the morning and go take care of dying people. It's like, good God, people deserve a bit of respect for struggling forward and not always trying to make the planet a worse place when they're beset on all sides constantly by, you know, an unending series of tragedy. You'd think we could have a little bit of sympathy for ourselves as a consequence of that. It's like we're not all like rapacious, greedy monsters who are bent on just devouring everything in our path, you know. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So, all right. Anyway, so let's go to the next part of this here. All right, so, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so, and God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Well, to understand that, because that doesn't make any sense at all, really. So I think I told you a little bit about this before. So the world that's being created in this particular account is a phenomenological world. There's a disk of land, because if you go out in a field and you look around, you're on a disk of land, so that's pretty obvious. And then there's a dome on top of it. It's more or less held up by the mountains, and rain comes down, so there's water above the dome, because where else would the rain come from? And underneath the ground, there's fresh water. You can drill down and find that. And then around that, there's salt water. And so that's the world. And it's kind of an empirical world, because if you're a child and you just go out in a field and you look at the world, that's sort of what it would be like. And so that's the world that's being created. And so one of the things that is worth thinking about, and this is something Carl Jung was very interested in, is that these old descriptions are half geographical and half empirical, so sort of based on observation, and half psychological. So one of the things Jung was interested in, for example, was astrology, but mostly for a psychological reason, because, you know, there are stars up on the dome, and then when you look at the stars, you can imagine the shapes of the stars, and that helps you orient yourself, because as soon as you can see shapes in the stars, then you can recognize the constellations and you can orient yourself at night. But then the constellations become gods, say, and the gods turn into a drama. And the drama comes from within. It's the projection of imagination. And so when Jung was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology, because he saw the astrological narrative as the projection of the human imagination onto the cosmos. And so when he was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology. And the same thing is the case with these stories, is that the world they describe is it's not the natural world like a scientist would describe it, because these people weren't scientists. They didn't have the technology and the tools. It was the way for them it was the world. For us, it's the way they saw the world. And so we're looking at the way they saw the world. And a lot of that's psychology, and we share that psychology to a large degree with those people. So in this is psychology. But it's interesting to know what the geographical substrate is, so that you can kind of understand the stories. And I like this picture, because it's great from a psychological perspective. It's a very famous picture, and so basically what you have here is the world as we know it, and there's the dome with the sun and the moon on it and the stars, and then if you look outside what you know, well then you're out into this cosmic space, right? And those are like the wheels of the planets and the music of the spheres, and that's the ever-present explorer who's gone beyond the domain that he can understand and is peering out into the unknown as such. And it's a psychological picture. It's like, because you do know some things, and then outside of that there are things you don't know, and when you're feeling brave, you put a foot or two out where you don't understand, like, because there's frontier everywhere, right? And if you're feeling heroic and you want to do something for the world and you want to expand what you understand, you poke your head through what you know and you take a look at whatever structure is out there. And he's pretty smart, because most of them is still where it's safe, and I would say that's a good thing, because if you jump right out there, well, then maybe you fall off the edge of the earth, and I wouldn't precisely recommend that, especially if you do it accidentally. And to me, this is a recreation of the Taoist yin-yang symbol, with the white paisley here, and that's what you know, and the dark paisley serpents really there, and the right place to be is right on the line between them, because you got one foot where you understand, that gives you security, and then, but it's kind of dull, because, hey, you know everything that's going on there, and that isn't what people are like. They don't want just security. Dostoevsky said that in Notes from the Underground, a great, great book. And, he said, I love this, it was an early criticism of the notion of a political utopia. He said, look, if you gave people everything they wanted, they had nothing to eat but cake, and nothing to do but sit in warm pools and busy themselves with the continuation of the species. That was his lines. That the first thing they would do, well, maybe after the first week, was like go kind of half insane and smash everything up, just so that something that they didn't expect would happen, so that they'd have something interesting to do. And it's so right, because the utopian notion that if you just had all the material stuff you wanted, that you'd be, well, what would you be? What would you do? Would you just sit on the couch and watch TV? I mean, you'd be, I don't know what, you'd be cutting yourself just for entertainment in no time flat, and that's the sort of thing that people do. And so we're not adapted for security and utopia. We're adapted for a certain amount of security, because, we are vulnerable, but mostly we want to have one foot out where we don't know what the hell is going on, because that's where you're alert and alive and tense and with it. And I believe this, and I believe it actually has something to do with the hemispheric structure of the physiology of your brain, is because the right hemisphere looks roughly adapted to what you don't know, and the left hemisphere, and this is an oversimplification, but a useful one, is adapted to the world that you do know, and the right place for you to be is halfway between them. Because and you can tell that. That's what's so cool. And this tells you that this is actually reality that's manifesting itself to you. That sense of active engagement you have in the world when things are working well for you, where you should be at the right time. You're alert and on top of things and engaged, and you don't have much of a sense of time, and the sense of the tragedy of life sort of recedes. And that's when you've got one foot where it's secure and one foot out in the unknown, and your brain signals to you that you're in the right place by making what you're doing meaningful. And that sense of meaning is actually a neurophysiological signal that you've got the forces of the cosmos properly balanced in your being at that moment. And that's why it feels so good. And then, well, what else could it possibly be? I mean, our brain is capable of looking beyond our vision. That's what it's for. And that sense of engagement, there's no reason to assume that that's anything but a real signal. And you can reduce it. You could say, well, the problem with being where you know only is that you don't know everything. And that's going to be a problem in the future. And the problem with being where you know nothing is that's just too much, man. Like, you go into panic mode, and because anything can happen there and you can't handle it. So you got to mediate between those two things. You want to be secure enough so that your physiology isn't revving out of control, and you want to be out there in the unknown enough so that you keep updating yourself constantly. And that's the place where information flow is maximized. And you know that because that's where you are when you're having a really interesting conversation with someone, or you're gripped by a book, or you're really into a movie, or maybe something that you do as apart from your work, or maybe even in your work, you're into it. And that's because you are in the right place at the right time. And your whole nervous system is signaling that to you. And I would say that's the sort of place that you should be all the time. Of course, you can't be because no one's perfect, but that's the recreation of paradise on earth. It's something like it because you are in the right place at the right time when that is happening, subject to certain, what would you say, restrictions that we can talk about later. Well, that's what this guy's doing, and that's, I would say, akin to the action that God is taking when he's transforming the chaos of potential into habitable being. And it's the sort of thing that human beings are supposed to act out. And God said, let the waters under heaven be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, that's an interesting thing too, because, there's this play written by a German named Goethe. I can never say that properly. It's Johann van Goethe, and I can't say it, but he wrote this play called Faust, and he wrote one part of it when he was quite young, and then Faust 2 when he was quite old. And he has a character in there, Mephistopheles, and Mephistopheles is the devil. And he actually has the devil explain himself twice, basically using the same words, which I really like. It was very profound. And basically, Goethe's Mephistopheles says, he's the adversary of the word. That's a good way of putting it. Because that's how it works out mythologically. He's the figure behind the snake in the Garden of Eden, which is something we'll talk about more. But he has a sophisticated philosophy. He's not just some random troublemaker. He's got a deep philosophy, and his philosophy is quite straightforward. And it's compelling. It's compelling. And people are gripped by it quite often, far more often than they think. And his philosophy is, well, look around at the world. It's like Ivan Karamazov in the Brothers Karamazov, when he's trying to disabuse his younger brother of being a Christian monk. Mephistopheles says, well, look at the world. I mean, you look around the world, it's nothing but a bloodbath. It's just suffering everywhere. Everything eats everything, and people die terribly, and they're cruel to one another, and the whole mess is nothing but a constant haul of terrible carnage and ruin and wreck. He says it'd be better if it was never existed at all. And that's a very, very interesting idea. And I do believe, and I've seen this in people many times, that in the depths of despair, especially when you've been betrayed, for example, and you wander into the wrong subdivision of the underworld, that's something that comes to mind. If you have a very sick child, for example, or maybe your whole family is suffering, as whole families do sometimes, an idea is going to come to you. It's like, good God, who put this mess together? And is it really worth it? Is it really worth the suffering? Suicidal people, they say no. They say, no, enough of this. And you have to be pushed a long way, generally speaking, before you'll actually commit suicide. You have to be in very, very desperate straits. But your answer under those conditions is that being is such that it would be better if it had never been. And that's I think it's a terrible philosophy, I believe, because I think what happens if you act it out is that you make the very things that led you to despair far worse. And I can't see that if it's reasonable to draw a logical conclusion that suffering justifies your desire to make being end, that the answer to that can't be to produce more suffering. That just doesn't make sense. And my observation has been that people who act out the Mephistophelian philosophy inevitably make suffering far worse. And then that raises the other specter of, well, do they want being just to cease, or are they just out for bloody revenge at any cost? And my conclusion has always been is that the mask is, well, being shouldn't exist because it's too terrible, but the true motivation is I'm going to make everyone suffer as much as I possibly can before I say goodbye to this place. And if you read the writings of people like the kids who shot up the Columbine High School, they'll tell you exactly that that's precisely and exactly what they concluded and then acted out. So anyways, but in this, God says that it was good. And I've thought about that a lot. It's like, because the question is something like, well, is something better than nothing? Because that's a really good question, And I thought about two things in relationship to that. And one is, well, maybe it depends on how it is that you are. Right? Because it could be that there are ways of being in the world that justify the world. And there are ways of being in the world that make the world unbearable. And I believe that the narrative that runs through the biblical stories is precisely a dialogue between those two types of being. And the optimistic part of the story is that being requires limitation and suffering. There's no escape from that. But there are modes of being that allow that to be perhaps even more than tolerable. Perhaps there are modes of being that allow that to be good. And it's a straight and narrow road. It's a very difficult road to tread. So I think, well, that's possible. You know, I'm not an optimist by nature. But that's one of the things that I've conceptualized and read about that I actually find plausible, because it's certainly the case, everyone knows this, that there are ways that you can act that make things worse. Everyone knows that. And so if that's the case, there has to be the opposite, right? There has to be ways that you could act that make things better. And obviously you can act in ways that make things really way worse. And so the question is, well, are there ways that you can act that make things really much better? And I think that's the question, is can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have the being that requires limitation and suffering, and also simultaneously transcend that by our mode of being? And I believe that the biblical stories, and perhaps not only the biblical stories, but the biblical stories are one of the human imagination's best attempts to address and answer that question. That's what the entire story is about. So the first of it is the catastrophe of the collapse of self-consciousness and the entrance of humanity into history. And the rest of it is, okay, now we're in history. Now we know that we're going to die. We know about our mortality. We're conscious of our own being. Is there a mode of acting in the world that allows that to be justifiable, or maybe even more, that allows that to be triumphant? And then I would also say, maybe it's worth finding out, you know. That's the other thing that's so interesting, because you've got this short time on Earth, and there's lots of things that are very, very difficult to contend with. And you have the problem of tolerating yourself even in all your insufficiency. And one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that if you adopt a sufficiently profound mode of being, if you attempt to do that, then the mere act of lifting up that weight is enough to justify the fact that you're insufficient and mortal and bound by tragedy. And I believe that, and I believe people believe that, because if you watch how people act, they look for people they admire. And they do admire people, right? It's a natural phenomenon. You see it starting with children. Children admire and then they imitate. And we look to people who seem to be able to bear the burden of being in a heroic manner, and there's something inside of us that calls to that, and it makes us want to mimic that and to follow it. And I think that that's the deepest and most profound of instincts, and I think it's right. And even if you're not so convinced on the positive end, you know, because it's more difficult to be convinced of the positive, you can certainly be convinced on the negative end, because there are ways of being that are so brutal and so reprehensible that merely to read about them is enough to traumatize you. And I think that if you're a person who hasn't lost their soul completely, you can't help but encounter stories like that and shudder away from them. And, you know, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was the person who did most to unmask the absolute horrors of communist totalitarianism, said that he believed that the Nuremberg judgments were the most important event of the 20th century. And that was the judgment at the end of World War II, that there were certain actions that no one was to undertake, no matter what their cultural background was, because they were, let's say, crimes against humanity. That there was such a thing as universal evil. And you can debate that, you know, I mean, and people certainly have, but the problem is if you debate that, then you have to say that there are conditions under which the sorts of things that happened, say, in the concentration camps, which would be the gassing of children after their torture and their forcible removal from their parents and all the terrible things that went along with that, that's just okay. It's just an opinion. It's just something that happened, and there are circumstances under which that's justifiable. If there's no transcendent good and evil underneath that argument, it's only a matter of practicality. And it seems to me that that's not the right conclusion to draw. That's how it seems to me, and that's what Solzhenitsyn concluded when he looked at the Nuremberg trials. So the notion that it was good, well, even if you don't believe that, and you know, because maybe it's not as good as it could be, I would say it's incumbent on you as someone who participates in the process of furthering creation to act as if it could be good at least, and to further that with all of your efforts. Partly because what the hell else do you have to do that could possibly be better than that could possibly justify your existence more than that? And you know perfectly well, if you have any sense at all, if you think clearly about it at all, is that that's what you want to see in everyone else. You know, you're desperate and maybe you're cynical, and now and then someone appears that acts at least momentarily like a light in the darkness, and that lifts your spirit up and gives you a little bit of hope and maybe helps you continue on. Well, that's obviously a call to being. It's a statement from your own soul that says, well, there's something about that that's how you should be. And maybe then, well, we get a chance to participate in what is good. I've thought too, you know, well, we'll leave that for a little later. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kind, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. I like that. You see, it's interesting, these old pictures, because if you look here, you got this halo around God's head, and you've got this split again between night and darkness, and God's right on the border between the two. And that's the sun, right? That's what a halo is. A halo is the sun or the moon. Sometimes it's like a coin. You know, you have the queen's head on the coin, and that's the queen on the moon, and it's silver, and it's a symbol of value, because of course the queen is sovereign, and the moon is the sovereign of the night sky, and gold, of course, is the sun, and gold is pure because it doesn't mix with other metals, and it shines like the sun, so it partakes of the sun, and God partakes of the sun because there's something about whatever he represents that's associated with consciousness and illumination and enlightenment, and it's that force of illumination and enlightenment that's right on the border between these two sets of phenomena, and that's kind of what that picture is trying to present. And so, you know, it's a metaphor. That's one way of thinking about it, but it does, again, allude to the underlying idea that there's something about consciousness that's integral to being itself. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. I mean, that's a remarkable bit of writing there too, because you just think about how bloody long it took our caveman ancestors to look at the night sky and start to figure out that there were repeating patterns across years that enabled them to mark the seasons. I mean, I just can't imagine how they figured that out. It's the degree of careful observation that it took. And I mean, we know people figured that out a long time ago, because you know, those great megalithic monuments like Stonehenge seem to be astronomical observatories, essentially. And you see the same thing with the pyramids. I mean, people were looking at the damn sky, trying to figure out, looking at God, you know, because that's kind of what you're doing when you're looking at the night sky, trying to figure out the regularity and order in the universe, and that's all compacted into this little line, you know, and let them be for signs and for seasons, to be oriented by the stars. Amazing. And then let them be lights in the expanse of heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night. And so there's an idea of sovereignty there too, right? That there's an analogy between the ruler and the heavenly bodies that light up the darkness, essentially. And that's a really interesting idea too, because it took us a long time to come to terms with, as I mentioned last week, to come to terms with the idea of sovereignty itself, and to decide what constituted valid power. And it's not power. It's not power. It's authority and competence, and not power. It's not dominance either. It's more sophisticated than that, because the people that you want to rule aren't people who have power, because power just means I can hurt you and you can't hurt me back. That's not what you need from a ruler, even though it devolves into that from time to time. What you want is the kind of wisdom that illuminates the darkness, and to associate the sovereign with the heavenly kings of the light is a perfectly reasonable thing to do from a metaphoric perspective. And that's an ancient idea, you know. And another example of how we're grounded in a dream. And God set them in the expanse of heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Another emphasis on the fact that it was better that there was something than nothing. And you know, maybe you could consider that the declaration of the cosmos is something like, well, it's better that there's something than nothing. And well, how do you know that? And I guess the answer to that is that there's something instead of nothing. And I know that that's not proof, but it's still a remarkable fact that it happens to be the case, and no one does know why that is. And so maybe we should go along with it and see what we can do with it, you know, and see how we could make it better, because we certainly could if we were really committed to it, and we shook our resentment and our anger and our hatred. And I know there's reason for all of that, because people do suffer terribly, but you know, God only knows what being could be like if we all contributed to it to the best of our ability. God only knows what we could conquer, and what sort of magnificent cities we could produce, and what things we could eradicate from the suffering of the world. And there was, you know, there's this guy I read about, this is amazing, and I don't remember his name, but he found out about this worm that was called the guinea worm. And guinea worm is a really horrible thing, and you can look it up if you want, but I'll tell you a little bit about it, even though it's very distasteful. So a guinea worm is a parasite that lives in Africa, and it burrows under your skin, and it's quite long. It's about that long, and it's, you know, about that wide, and so it'll burrow underneath your leg, and then it's in there, you know, and maybe it pokes its little head out a hole, which is one of its delightful tendencies. And then if you want to pull it out, it breaks, right? Because obviously, because otherwise you'd just pull it out and it would be dead. And so it doesn't like that, so it just breaks off. And many people had this horrible disease, you know, and well, you can't imagine what that would be like, because you're part of the 1% and you live in North America, and thank God for that. But you know, just a little imagine, you don't even want to think about it, let alone have it. And he went to Africa and wiped the damn thing out. It's like, well, great, you know, it seems to me the planet's a lot better off without any guinea worms on it. Even though that's like guinea worm genocide talk, I'm still, you know, pretty happy about it. And so that was one guy who thought, well, we don't need these things. And yeah, well, fair enough, you know, and yeah, well, so good for him. Like, you know, I mean, he can die thinking that the world's a better place than it was when he first popped out, and so good for that. I think that's a good aim, you know. I think is to think that when you're on your deathbed, and you can look back and think, well, there's a little less suffering in the world from here on out than there would be if I had never existed. And that's a lot better than the opposite, because it's certainly possible, say, if you're Stalin, to ensure that there's a hell of a lot more suffering in the world than there would have been if you hadn't lived. And we perfectly well know that people can manage that, and that many people try to do nothing but manage precisely that. So, and it's hard for me not to think about that as some sort of metaphysical evil, and I think it's the right way to look at it. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So you have the sun here, and then the moon here, as far as I can tell. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I think this is the moon over here, but so, yeah, and that's part of the Sistine Chapel, which is, you know, an absolutely remarkable. And you know, part of the reason too, and part of the reason I'm teaching about these biblical stories is because, you know, I'm thinking, because the humanities have been decimated so badly, and again, I think that has mostly to do with resentment and hatred more than anything else. But I don't really think that you can get a grip on the humanities and what they have to offer without knowing the biblical stories, because they're the dream out of which the humanities emerge. And so unless you have that background knowledge, that dream, then there's all sorts of things that are utterly profound that don't open themselves up to you. And Dante's Inferno would be one of those, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which is an absolutely amazing piece of work. I mean, Milton wrote it because he wanted to justify the ways of God to man. You know, what an ambition that is. And I mean, he was serious about that. He took the problem seriously. It's like, it's the Mephistophelian problem, is that, well, this is a rough business that we're involved in, and, you know, maybe we should just give it up. And I think the whole world, I think, was deciding that in the 1980s, when we were deciding whether we were going to engage in the ultimate nuclear catastrophe, you know, and we were very, very close to that a number of times. And I think it was a collective decision in some sense on the part of humanity that we might as well keep the whole awful game going rather than just demolish it. But But, Milton, he wrote Paradise Lost to, it's a dream, again, it's a dream, and trying to explain the nature of being and the nature of evil, and you can't crack the damn thing without knowing the underlying stories, and that's really too bad because it's utterly profound. And the reason you need profound things, as far as I can tell, you need profound knowledge, is because life is actually a profound problem for everyone. I mean, you can shelter back and live a very conservative existence, and look, like, more power to you. I understand why you would do that, but it doesn't stop you from having to face the ultimate questions of life, right? They're right there in everyone's face, and at least at some point in your life. And it would be better if you could, I think, if you could confront them full on, and to deal with them properly, and to be a beacon of strength as a consequence of that. And I think that wisdom, that's what the humanities are supposed to teach, is wisdom. And wisdom is what enables you to deal honorably with the tragedy of life. And I can't see how you could think that that was a bad idea, because there are going to be times when you're in an emergency room and, prone to panic and to cry and to break down and to collapse and to be of no use to anyone around you. And that's not the right way to be. It's the right way to be in a situation like that is to be strong and reliable, and I don't think you can do that without being wise. And you can't be wise without putting yourself together and without knowing something about where you came from and what you're like, and that's history and the humanities. And so this isn't optional. It's more necessary. Man does not live by bread alone, and that's exactly the issue here. So you see these magnificent works, I mean, it's not like Michelangelo thought of this literally, he was a genius, for God's sake, and he's trying to get at something, and he's trying to get at the profundity of human culture. I suppose that's why you have this patriarchal figure here, and the cosmic role that consciousness and tradition plays in being itself, and it's ennobling. And you think, people, religious or not, people, hundreds of millions of people come from all over the world to Rome and go through this little tiny chapel to look at this. There's something in it that everyone needs to see. It's not just beauty, it's more than beauty. It's that which feeds the soul. And everyone feels that, even if they can't explain it. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. Kind, right? That's kin, right? And to be kind is to treat others as if they're your kin. And so, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. That's continually represented over and over. God said, that's the thing that calls being into existence. And God said it was good, and that's the fundamental judgment about the nature of reality. And, one of the things that happens in the translation, in the movement, let's say, from the Old Testament to the New Testament, is God is obviously blessing creation in the beginning of this story. And then you have Old Testament God, and don't mess around with him, right? Because he'll give you good smiting if you get out of line. There's no doubt about that. And he's kind of an arbitrary character. And, lots of modern people think, well, how could you believe in a God like that? And it's like, when I read that, I think, well, the Old Testament people, that isn't how they thought. They thought, you better look the hell out, because life is really difficult, and if you step out of line, you're going to get flattened, and God doesn't care, in some sense, whether you approve of him. It's like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? Obviously, you don't approve. It's like, you better pay attention, though, because otherwise you're going to be in real trouble. And there's real wisdom in that. Nietzsche really admired the Old Testament as a work of literature, because he thought that the representation of the divine, let's say, as a representation of the essential nature of being was extraordinarily accurate in its arbitrary and often cruel nature. It wasn't following a morality that human beings could really understand as moral, but he thought that was very realistic, and I like that interpretation. But what happens in the New Testament is quite interesting, because there's an insistence all of a sudden in the New Testament that you're supposed to act towards God as if he's nothing but good. And that's such a strange thing, because you look at the world and you think, yeah, really? Just good, eh? Well, the cancer and the earthquakes is kind of hard to fit into that picture. And, you know, the terrible things that happen to children and all of that is very difficult to square with the notion of a good God, obviously. But then the underlying idea is that if you act in that manner, it makes it more likely to be true. It's something like that. And so I would consider that in some sense an act of both courage and faith. It's like you're going to make the case, like God makes at the beginning of the Bible, that being is in fact good. Now, you can't see it because, well, you get to see all the things about it that aren't so good. That's not the point. It's a metaphysical presupposition, something like that. It's a decision to act that way. I'm going to act as if being is good and to further that. And then the implicit idea is, well, there isn't any way that you can make things work out better than to do that. And so there's a courageous element to it, which I think is also expressed to some degree in the idea of Christ's like voluntary sacrifice of his own life. His presupposition was something like, I'm going to act as if God is good, and I'm going to play that out right to the end. And now that becomes something like a divine pattern. And I believe there's wisdom in that, because, again, most of the time that I've been wrestling with this sort of thing, I've always been looking at the opposite. I haven't been studying good, I've been studying evil. Because evil is easier to believe, especially after the 20th century. It's like, I think you have to be blind not to think about the things that happened in the 20th century as evil. And some of the things that happened were so brutal, it's just absolutely unimaginable. And, well, unless you imagine it. And it's right there, it's part of the historical record. And then I think, well, if there's something that's that terrible, it indicates as clearly as anything can that there's also something that's its opposite, and that's whatever it is that's the farthest away possible from that outcome. Now, that doesn't mean we can exactly say what it is, because it's easier to grip, in some sense, what it means to torture and break and hurt, and not to be able to conceptualize so clearly how you would have to act if you were acting in the exact opposite manner. But at least it implies that it exists, and I see that pattern being laid out in this dreamlike manner in the New Testament, and it has something to do with, well, it has something to do, and this is for sure, with the voluntary acceptance of mortality. Because, of course, that's the poisoned apple, right? The fact that everybody looks forward into the future to know that you're finite, and so is everything that you love. And it's very difficult for that not to poison your existence. And, well, there's no getting out of it, as far as we can tell, but there might be something like switching your attitude to it, and you could say, well, that's the price you pay for being. And the heroic thing to do is to accept that, and not even to accept it grudgingly. To say, all right, I'm going to go along with that, I'm going to accept that, and I'm going to act nonetheless as if being is good, and then I'm going to see how things turn out. It's something like that. And God saw that it was good. And so it's an act of courage, right? There's an act of courage that's associated with that transformation of attitude. And even with regards to the notion that the world is good, it's a courageous attitude, especially given that there's so much evidence that makes that conclusion difficult to continually draw. But the alternative seems to me to be far worse. So there's God again with the sun behind him, because he's associated with the solar consciousness, and he's creating all these strange, wonderful creatures. And you know, and people say, well, you know, the idea of God as an old man in the sky, let's say, that's primitive. It's much more better to think about it as much more better? Jesus. Anyways, it's more sophisticated to think of the divine essence as a disembodied spirit or something like that. But you know, that's not so obvious either, because as I already pointed out, there isn't anything that's more complicated than a human being. And so the idea that the divine is something that's at least as complicated as a human being strikes me as something that's actually quite reasonable. And I know it's a metaphor, although I don't know to what degree it is a metaphor, and it's also something that's embodied. And that's also a very interesting notion, you know, because it's become increasingly obvious as we've tried to do such things as produce artificial intelligence, that it's very difficult to produce an intelligence or perhaps a consciousness that isn't embodied in some manner. It can't be just a spirit without form. And I think that's part of the reason too why Christianity put so much emphasis at the end of time on the resurrection of the body, because there's a drive in there to ennoble the idea of the body, not just the spirit, the consciousness that floats abstractly above the body, but to say that, no, you can't do that. You can't just shed that part of you that's heavy and material, so to speak, and leave it behind as if it's of no value. You have to ennoble that as well. And that idea is also linked to the representation of God as a human being, and as a wise human being, and as something that's embodied. And so, at least from the metaphorical perspective, I don't think it's reasonable just to brush your hands across it and say, well, that's primitive. Because I don't think it is. I don't think it's primitive at all. And then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And it's our because, well, this is part of the priestly story. There's, as I said, a number of sources for the Old Testament. And in the priestly version, if I remember correctly, it's Elohim. That may be wrong. It doesn't matter, but precisely it doesn't matter, because the notion is that the God who's in the background of this story has a kind of plurality of being, right? And it looks like the idea of monotheism arose with great difficulty across time, because there are lots of powers, and the idea that there's a power of powers was something that it wasn't easy for people to figure out, you know, and because what's constant across sources of power? Well, some kind of meta power, but it's hard to figure out what that is, and that's what's being represented by the movement, as far as I can tell, from polytheism to monotheism. It's the observation that there are powers that determine the destiny of people, at least in part, that you're subject to. And then the idea that there's something common across all those powers that you can represent, partly, say, with the idea of the sun rising in the morning and fighting its way out of the darkness at night, and that's associated with consciousness and sovereignty. There's see, one of the things that bothers me about simple-minded atheism, and I would say the simple-minded atheism is of the sort that regards these stories as nothing but simple superstitions, is that it's very, very poorly informed. Because whatever these stories are, they are not merely simple superstitions. They weren't conjured up by some cabal of priests to bamboozle the masses, even though they were used for that purposes from time to time. It's much, much more complicated than that. They have a very ancient lineage, and they're tied together with all sorts of other stories. And there's an emergent wisdom in them, and I think the right way to view them is as the birthplace of sophisticated philosophical ideas. And so you have to wrestle with these stories. You can't just... And I said already that I'm going to be as rational as I possibly can in my discussion of these stories, and not refer to anything metaphysical except when that's absolutely necessary, even though I don't want to eliminate the possibility of a metaphysical reality, because I think that's premature. But you have to take the story seriously if you're going to approach the problem properly. You can't just casually dismiss them. It's not appropriate. And so let us make man in our image. That's a very interesting idea. And like I said, it's not easy to understand how it was that human beings came up with the idea that us lowly creatures were... So with the Mesopotamians, for example, and the Greeks were like this too. Human beings weren't godlike. They were the playthings of the gods, right? They were just... The gods just tortured us for their amusement, you know. Love and hatred and anger and all those powerful forces. We were just playthings to the gods. There wasn't anything particularly divine about us. The notion that in some sense we partake of the divine that's a staggering idea. And you don't want to underestimate the difficulty that there was in abstracting that, or the utility of that idea for our current mode of being. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. That's interesting because there is more than one creation story in Genesis, and in this story, males and females are basically created at the same time. Later, Eve is extracted out of Adam, and we'll talk about that, but not here. It's the two sexes are generated simultaneously, and they both carry within them the divine stamp, which is very egalitarian and very appropriate, and I think unbelievably advanced. That's what it looks like to me. And God blessed them. Well, that's a good thing. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And there's God creating Adam and Eve. And they're looking pretty happy about the whole thing. And that's Michelangelo's famous Sistine Chapel representation. And there's some cool things about this. I mean, you got to wonder, this is an aside, and I don't know if it's a credible aside, but it's an interesting aside, so that's a form of credible. What the hell is God doing in this thing? You know, I mean, what is this exactly? And so there's been some interesting answers to that, and this is one of them. So there was a group of scientists about 20 years ago that were remarked on the precise analogy between this structure and the brain bisected down the middle. And of course, Michelangelo was one of the first people who did detailed dissections, and so they felt that Michelangelo had put God inside the brain for some reason. And that seems to me to be associated with the notion that there's an analogy or a metaphorical identity between the notion of whatever God is and the structures that give rise to consciousness. And I think we really underestimate the degree to which consciousness is both, say, miraculous and not understood. I mean, you know, you have what appears to be an entirely material substrate, yet here you are, aware and self-aware and able to generate the world merely in some sense by looking at it. It really is remarkable, and that consciousness is dependent on something that wells up from deep within that material substrate that we don't understand at all. It's really it's a crazily remarkable thing, you know. And you hear a lot about scientific reductionism, but I'll tell you something that's kind of interesting, and it's a tangent too. You know, the guy that discovered DNA, I think it was Watson. And it's Watson and Crick, but I don't remember who wrote this book, but one of them, I don't remember which one, he believed that DNA was so complicated that it had to come from space. He didn't believe it could have possibly evolved on Earth. And so, like a lot of these people who are used as exemplars of scientific reductionism aren't like that at all when you actually read what they had to say, right? They were very aware of the limits of their own knowledge. And I mean, DNA is something really quite spectacularly remarkable. It's an eternal substance. It's been around for a very long time, and the idea that we understand it is a very stupid idea. And I would say that the same thing applies to the brain. Like we're scratching away at the surface of something we don't understand at all. And so it's quite interesting, I think, that, and maybe Michelangelo had enough gall to do that. It's certainly possible. I mean, he had enough gall to do dissections when the cost of that was death. You know, he had to rob corpses essentially to go and do it. So he wasn't, I would say, not particularly politically correct. So that's kind of interesting. And there's another representation of the same thing. And that's a funny one. I had to throw that in. I don't know how many of you know this, but there's this joke in the atheist community. I think it might have been started by Richard Dawkins, but that might be wrong, that it was just as reasonable to believe in the flying spaghetti monster as it was to believe in God. And that's the flying spaghetti monster, by the way. And so that's called touched by his noodly appendage. And anyways, it's not very sophisticated, but it is funny. So, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heaven and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And I like that too, you know. I did a lot of counseling work with people who were, coaching work, I guess, with people who were fairly spectacularly successful, and they were usually workaholics. You know, they're the sort of people that were like, they'd work 80 hours a week, just nonstop. That's just what they were like. And one of the things we were always trying to figure out was, well, how much should you work? Because one answer is you just work till you die, right? I mean, you just exhaust yourself. And, well, that's not a good idea. And then you have to figure out why that isn't a good idea. It's got to be something like this, is that you don't want to do so much work that the amount of work you do interferes with the amount of work that you could still do, right? Because if you work like mad for 2 weeks and then you have to lie in a hospital bed for a month, that obviously isn't very productive. So you have to figure out how much you can work diligently and then how much you have to recuperate so that you can get back up and work again. And, you know, people have basically settled on something like this and given it the divine imprimatur. That's one way of thinking about it, which is, well, you can toil away for 6 days, and no wonder, because you have to work, but you should rest at least 1 day out of 7, because otherwise, well, you don't appreciate life. That might be part of it. And plus, I think it's more a matter of iterability, you know, because one of the things that defines morality is the capacity to repeat something, right? So if something is properly structured in a moral manner, then you can do it over and over and over again without any degeneration. And so that's kind of like a relationship. If your relationship is negotiated, you can continue to negotiate it, and then you can have a relationship that lasts for a long time. You can do it today and next week and